Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Tuesday topic on this beautiful, beautiful spring day. We are so grateful that you have decided to join us for today's talk. Today's Tuesday topic is biracial and multiracial experiences in an academic world with our panel. While I'm waiting for everyone's microphones to kick on and for everyone to settle in, and wait for a few more folks to join us. I'm going to just plug a couple of upcoming Tuesday topics that are coming pretty fast. We've got a big month ahead of us, and I'm just going to paste the link for the Tuesday topic straight into the chat for you. Next week, we've got the match game using recruitment platforms to find research participants. That's going to be from 12 to 1 on Tuesday, April 16th. And then the week after that, we've got writing, research, and teaching statements for academic jobs, which is Tuesday, April 23rd, also from 12 to 1. Those two are both via Zoom. And then rounding out the month, another one from the Board of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, inclusive support for transgender and gender diverse students and staff on Tuesday, April 30th, in this time zone from 4 to 5. So without further ado, let me throw it over to Nicole Lamb, who is our moderator for today's event. Nicole, take it away.
Thank you. Just a moment. I'm going to share my screen with everyone. So this Tuesday topic, as Darren said, is the multiracial lives and experiences in an academic world. My name is Nicole Lamb. I will be your moderator today, and our panelists are Jasmyn, Gabrielle, and Amanda. These panelists will be talking through their different experiences, starting with our undergraduate panelist, Jasmyn, through graduate school to Gabrielle, and now working as an associate director in the office of the dean is Amanda. So why is this important? Throughout my life, I realized that my background as a half Chinese, half Caucasian, which I believe is Dutch person, I experienced some things that people around me didn't have. They didn't have those experiences, and they didn't quite understand that some of these things were happening to me. And so after coming to Drexel and joining the College of Nursing and Health Professions Board of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I realized that this was an incredibly important thing to discuss and share with others. In my childhood, I very much looked like your stereotypical Asian child. And when I was being carried around as an infant or a toddler by my mother, people assumed that I wasn't hers, that I was adopted and not her biological child. Moving on to primary school and having to fill out certain forms where they asked you to identify your race or your ethnicity, my teachers told me, just pick one, because there weren't options that allowed me to share both aspects of my background. And moving on to learning about this racist song that my elementary school, shall I say, friends or classmates, that they sang in the bus that was incredibly racist and disrespectful towards Asian populations, talking about assaulting an Asian worker in their place of work, not feeling sorry about it, and pulling at their eyes to show that Asian people look different, pointing out that they're different than their white counterparts, shall we say. And so through this topic and through this experience, I want to break the stigma about talking about race, that even though it can be somewhat taboo to share these experiences, it's more important to educate others about things that have happened in the past, things that happen currently, and ways that we can improve in the future. And through this, I'd like to provide a safe space for other biracial and multiracial students to do the same. Now, if anybody has any questions or comments, please leave them in the chat, and we will provide some time to answer those at the end of the presentation. So, talking about race, ethnicity, and everything in between, I wanted to spend some time leaving up this definition page just for your perusal for a couple of minutes, um, just to make sure that we were all on the same page about what these terms mean. So, moving on to some of the statistics that I found about Drexel. In Drexel and the way that we conduct statistics through about race and ethnicity, throughout the years, we found that there's about 4% of the undergraduate population that identifies as two or more races. It's possible that those that select unknown may also be a part of this, or even those who, as I said before, just pick one could also be a part of the more than one race category, even though they did not select that. And that being said, over 72 different countries are represented in the Drexel student population, so there is an incredible diversity that should be celebrated. In the 2020 US Census, it showed that the two or more races population increased dramatically, and we can see that that trend is likely to continue as we move forward through time. So moving on, I'd love to bring this over to Jasmyn and allow her to talk about her experience as a multiracial undergraduate student.
Thank you, Nicole. Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmyn Rolison. I am a first-year human development and counseling major, and I'm excited to talk about my experiences in Drexel thus far and identifying as a biracial student. So, about my background, my dad is African American and my mom is Colombian. And I grew up mostly in a predominantly white area in Northern Virginia, right outside of DC. So I had a hard time kind of feeling like I could relate to others around me, especially because there weren't many other students around me who identified as bi or multiracial. And, that really made it hard for me all throughout elementary, middle, and high school to really kind of find my crowd and embrace my identity without feeling, kind of stigmatized and also discriminated against because, my two different cultures didn't really align or conform to the predominant culture.
So, Jasmyn, could you tell us a little bit more about how you were raised and any microaggressions or colorism that you or anybody around you may have experienced?
Yeah, definitely. So to kind of backtrack on what I was saying that, I grew up in a predominantly white area. It was really hard for me to kind of gain a sense of community with others of similar racial or ethnic background. And unfortunately, even in my Black or Hispanic communities that I would try to be involved in, there was often kind of like a discriminatory practices because I couldn't really conform to the traditional ways that most of those who identify as part of that culture could relate to. And so, unfortunately, I kind of had to undergo internal and external conflict. So what I mean by internal conflict is kind of how we feel about the multiple parts of our identity. And so an example that relates to my personal experiences is I felt like I couldn't identify as Hispanic because I didn't appear the way that, typically society envisions Hispanic people to look like. Which is often due to an education on, the fact that Hispanic isn't a race, it's an ethnicity, and multiple races could make up the population. And as for external conflict, that is how others feel about the multiple parts of our identities. So, unfortunately, anytime that I would try to be part of a community in school that was Black or Hispanic, I oftentimes was treated in a way that I was different than because I didn't fully appear as, most did. And as a result of that, I often faced microaggressions, specifically about my Afro-textured hair, because it doesn't really conform to the Latino beauty standards. And that appeared more of my Black side rather than my Hispanic side. And so unfortunately, in the eyes of people who aren't really familiar with the different populations in the Latino population, Afro-textured hair means Black, and then that means not Hispanic. And, that's kind of like the form of microaggression that I often encountered. And yeah, unfortunately, those were the different conflicts that I faced all throughout my time before college. And yeah, unfortunately, that's something that many experience who have kind of different cultures and don't conform to the image that one has of a specific culture.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It really sounds like the words that people use can be so hurtful and leave so many lasting effects, even when they may not realize it. So, Gabrielle, could you tell us a little bit more about your experience now that you had a couple more years under your belt now as a graduate student?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name's Gabrielle. I do just want to preface, I am in an office that's right next to a train station. So if you hear the train, that's where that's coming from. So I just want to apologize for that future. Yes. So I am currently a third-year doctoral student in the couple and family therapy program. I also did complete my master's at Drexel as well too. So I've been here now for this is year 5. So I am biracial. It's actually interesting because it's been a couple years since I've actually utilized biracial. So my father's African American, born in the US, and my mother is French, so she's white, born and raised in France. She did not immigrate to the US until she was in her early 20s. And I've moved around my entire life. So I've really lived with different groups of people throughout my life. Growing up, I did live in a predominantly white place in West Virginia. I was born in California, but we moved to West Virginia. And that's really where I was raised from the ages of 5 to, I believe, 10 or 11. And to be honest, race was not a topic of discussion in my household, which is very interesting. As I've processed my identity, especially in college. It hasn't been till recently since I really started having to process and understand my identity and recognizing that I really do identify with my Black side. And a lot of that has to do just with how I was raised, my comfortability around particularly my father's family. I have had the privilege to visit France. And I'm sure I don't know if a lot of you know, but it's very taboo to talk about race there. So I am the only child of color on my mother's side. And so that experience was very uncomfortable for me growing up. I did feel very ostracized. So that is not the side that I really feel like home, if that makes sense. So so the growing up in different places has kind of really allowed for me to explore different, like to understand different identities, but also recognizing like that majority of the individuals that I interacted with were not biracial. And if they were, I was not aware of it. And so, yeah, that's kind of a little bit about me. I will ramble about this topic. So I'm sorry.
No worries. It's really interesting to hear about how we had that similar experience where talking about race is a little bit taboo, and that it takes time to really figure out your identity after the fact if it's not talked about in your early childhood or with your parents or guardians. So could you tell us a little bit more about what it was like going to school at a PWI?
Sure. So, like I said, college was really where I started. Like, well, I shouldn't say that. High school, like at the cusp when I graduate, like when I was a senior, junior, as well, when I really started understanding like my identity. Like I said, I moved around a lot. So my freshman year in high school, I went to a predominantly Black high school in Florida. And then we moved back to California and I went to a predominantly Asian high school. And that was very like jarring for me. My experiences were very, definitely experienced a lot of microaggressions and had a difficult time adjusting to, I would say, like customs that I think was part of the high school. I was oftentimes the only Black student in my class. So that was also an added layer to me understanding like, okay, I am just Black. I'm not white. I can't really identify with that. So making the transition to college really allowed for me to understand like, okay, where do I fit in? And I think that goes with what does it mean to be Black enough? When I did go to college, I did try to, similarly as Jasmyn, like try to, okay, how is my experience with being around just white people? How's my experience just being around Black individuals? And oftentimes Black individuals would tell me that I'm not Black enough. Well, you're just only 50%. So that really like that's really something that I'm still personally grappling with, because I don't know if individuals understand like the magnitude of the language of just telling someone you're only half when I'm both. And so, yeah, that's kind of like was my experience, like really trying to understand my identity, but also recognizing that it didn't feel like I could be in both. It felt like I had to choose. Like I could either be a part of this population or this population. I was never really able to choose. And so that's really essentially how my undergrad experience was like. I will say like graduate has been a completely different experience for me. And I think a lot of that just has to do with like you're in smaller cohorts. So I feel like you're kind of forced to have to be with the groups of people that you're in graduate school. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It really sounds like being told that you're not Black enough or you're only half is an incredibly invalidating way of speaking to somebody. And the way that when you are in a school or a group that is primarily one race or one ethnicity, that those ethnicities tend to be prioritized, and you don't want somebody to be minoritized because you're already feeling different and othered and ostracized, and there's no reason to make that experience any worse. And talking about the way that people use their words and the way that it can be hurtful, or there are other ways where it can be not so hurtful. It doesn't have to be a bad experience to discuss race and ethnicity. So off of that point, would you say there's a right or a wrong way to ask about race and ethnicity? Is there a way to go about that in a way that's more understanding and trying to educate yourself and be better, as opposed to make assumptions about others and put them down for it?
I do think so. So when I was growing up, and I feel still today, people will come up to me like, "So what are you?" Like that is like, what am I? Like, are you asking me if I'm like an animal? Am I like, so it's like, I would feel more comfortable for people to just genuinely like, I'm having a really difficult time trying to figure out what your like racial and ethnic background is. Can you tell me what that is? Versus like just coming up and asking me some egregious question about like, what are you? And I don't know if Amanda, Jasmyn, and Nicole have had similar experiences of like people trying to figure out what you are and just being like, okay, so I'm just going to go up to them and ask them like this crazy question and having an uncomfortable response of like, okay, how do I respond to this? So, yeah, I think genuine curiosity, I'm okay with. Like, I'm genuinely okay with people wondering like what my background, like my ethnic and racial background is. I have no issue with that. I think the issue is going back to what was said in the beginning. People do have a hard time asking people about other individuals' racial and ethnic background. So I think rather than coming in with like assumptions, I think coming in with genuine curiosity and just being like, I can't figure you out. What's your racial background or what's your background? So yeah.
Absolutely. I definitely have had similar experiences to that. And it can feel very, I guess, invalidating to have somebody treat you like, what are you? That could be, it could mean anything. You could say, I am a United States citizen, or I'm a college student. But to know that they mean, what is your racial or ethnic background? But yet somehow it's more acceptable to ask in a way without using those words, race or ethnicity, to imply it, when really it's doing more harm than good. And after talking to you about your graduate school experiences and how it's been a little bit better due to the smaller cohorts and being able to have more interpersonal connections with those people, can you tell us a little bit more about being the token biracial advocate because there isn't really anyone else around who's willing to stand up and speak about it?
Sure. Yeah. So I think something that I've noticed in both of the universities that I've attended, oftentimes you have spaces for individuals that are Asian or Black or Latinx and Hispanic. Like, you have spaces for those individuals, but I personally have never seen spaces for multiracial or biracial individuals. And so I feel like, just like being the token Black person, I feel like oftentimes in my courses, so as I stated, I'm in getting my doctorate in couple and family therapy. So oftentimes, well, I had a course that spoke about like culture and race and whatnot. And we never discussed multiracial, multicultural, biracial individuals. That was never a topic of discussion. So there was a lot of areas that were missing. So I did oftentimes have to let that be known, like, okay, there are more than just like one. So being able to have to kind of like speak up consistently can be frustrating, because you would think that with the amount of individuals that are biracial and multiracial in the US, that people would recognize that there are other couples, there are other families that don't look like your regular families that are portrayed, I should say, in like the media. And so I think, yeah, being the token biracial advocate, I feel like it has always been I feel like it's important to me because that's my identity, but also recognizing that it can be very frustrating to have to constantly be like, hey, like, what about this population of people? Are we going to talk about these individuals and the struggles that they have to experience?
Absolutely. And one last thing, if you didn't have to be the only biracial advocate, do you think that it is okay or that it should be encouraged for other people who aren't biracial or multiracial to also bring up if there is a problem that biracial or multiracial people are being looked over or their experiences aren't being portrayed in your case?
I think so, because oftentimes what I find out is like, while there might be individuals that that might not be biracial, oftentimes you find out that those individuals have family members who are in interracial families or interracial, family dynamics. And some of them, I'm not going to say all of them, can recognize like the differences or like the experiences that individual has to go through. So I do feel like it should be discussed more, and it shouldn't just be individuals who identify with that to have to bring that to attention, because I think, like I stated, like that it gets frustrating, draining over time.
Absolutely. And currently, like as we saw earlier, due to like the current undergraduate statistics, that there's only about 4% of the population that identifies as two or more races. That doesn't mean that a biracial or multiracial person is always going to be in the room with you. And if they're not there, what is being said behind closed doors? Are other people going to speak up for you when you're not there?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Moving on to Amanda, could you tell us a little bit more about your experiences, ranging from, shall we say, elementary school all the way up to working in Drexel administration?
Hi, as Nicole said, my name is Amanda. I work at Drexel CNHP's Office of the Dean, and I also support Dr. Carey, our Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I am half Chinese and half Caucasian, English, and I believe Irish. My grandfather was adopted. In terms of my biracial experiences, I also grew up in a predominantly white community. My mother's side lived very far away. My mother is the one who is Chinese, and her whole family lived very far away, and we didn't see them very often. So most of my exposure was actually to my dad's side of the family. And I think that's something that was interesting for me, and that has also kind of been alluded to as feeling like an outsider at your own family gatherings. So on my father's side, that's where most of our family gatherings were hosted. And you can't help but notice that you don't look like everybody else. And that was always very difficult. And kind of as I would go through life, like going to a Chinese restaurant or seeing, my dad's side of the family, when I did meet an Asian person, they thought I looked like my dad. And when I met a Caucasian person, they thought I looked like my mom. And when you kind of pause to think about like, what did that mean in that moment? I was just like, whatever. But when I stopped to think about it, it really feels like neither side is claiming me. Both sides are saying I'm not them. So if I'm not them, then kind of who am I? Because those are the two people, those are the two groups I should be a part of. And everyone is saying I'm the other. So that was really hurtful. And then when we did see my mom's side of the family, it was always at big gatherings. And they would actually have a table for all of those who married outside the race. So there were, the 10 to 15 tables of Chinese families that were my relatives. And honestly, those that I didn't know very well. And I didn't really have an opportunity to meet them because we were at the table with all of those that had married a spouse of a different race. And so, again, just feeling like an outsider with your own family is kind of a hard thing to kind of wrap your head around. But anyway, that's more of the personal, how it was in academia. Much like, Gabrielle, Jasmyn, and Nicole all alluded to, feeling, like the only biracial student. We didn't talk about race very much either when I was growing up, but I do know I was the only one who raised their hand within the first 5 questions of the standardized test because I didn't know what to pick. And same thing, getting the pick one. And I think as a child, I tried to reconcile that. So sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm going to mess with the data. I'm going to pick Asian this week and I'm going to be white next week and you all can figure it out. I don't know if I really skewed anybody's numbers, but in my head, that was the way to kind of lighten what it really meant, that I couldn't truly identify who I was. So I would alternate depending on my mood. I don't think that I really messed anything up, but in my head, I hoped I did. And also not only was it biracial, but, biracial in a race that was also very underrepresented, in my school. And so, I'm half Chinese, and growing up, I had, very little exposure to my Chinese, side of the family and culture that went with it. And yet a Chinese student moved to our school district. And I say my school district, I don't mean my class, I don't mean my school, I mean the entire district. A Chinese student moved in. And the district called my mom because in thousands of students in my school district, they knew my mom was Chinese and they didn't know what to do with a Chinese student. So all of a sudden, while I was kind of, half and half, I felt very much like an outsider, because all of a sudden they're like, oh, you're the one family that we can call in this entire school district. And, and the student had different experiences and obviously spoke differently than my classmates did. And a lot of it was like, why is he so weird? I'm like we met him at the same time you did. And it's cultural and it's a different language, and trying to explain all of that, but still also not really understanding his culture either, even though the school district thought that we would. So it was very much feeling like the only biracial student in school when you're raising your hand and asking, what do I select here? And also just knowing that in a district of thousands of students, they all knew we were a Chinese family that they could call, which was a little strange.
Absolutely, Amanda. And it's really interesting and quite upsetting that the school district knew how little support they had in their system, that they had to call on a member of their community, your mom, who is not really a part of the school or the school administration or anything, just a parent living her life. Their child went to school here, and somehow it became your family's responsibility to help rehabilitate this new student into your culture.
It was definitely an experience.
For sure. Could you tell us a little bit more about what it's like visiting China? Because as you mentioned earlier, you didn't feel super connected to your Asian side, whether it's not feeling super connected while at those dinners and not being able to perhaps speak with and communicate as easily with those members of your family?
Sure. When I was 18, my mom and I went back to China, and it was actually the first time she had returned to China since she left when she was 7 years old. And because she also didn't have a lot of ties to the country, we did a group tour and we traveled around with the tour and did all the touristy things, the temples and the restaurants and the opera and all of that. And when I went there, I felt like I was a traveling exhibit, because everyone would come up to me and say, what are you? Which I was used to hearing, in the United States, but this was a whole new population asking me the same question. And I'd say I'm half Chinese and half Caucasian, and they'd go back and laugh about it in, Mandarin or Shanghainese, wherever we were traveling to. And then they'd be like, is it your mom or your dad? And, and I had all these questions, and this entire population just thought it was so strange and such a curiosity. And again, this was supposed to be a community that I'm part of to a degree, or just that I'm supposed to be a part of. And they were treating me like it's such an oddity. And again, like you try to laugh it off, and but it was hard because again, like this was my chance to see where my mom grew up. We had an opportunity to visit some of her great aunts and visit the land where their house was. And wow, was it evident that I didn't fit in. And that was really hard.
Absolutely. It's like traveling your whole life across countries, across the ocean, trying to find somewhere where you fit in, see other people like you, people who understand what you've been through and your experiences, and not being able to find that necessarily your entire childhood in the United States, and not being able to find that in China either. Could you tell us about what it was like to finally meet somebody who has the same racial background as you?
Sure. It actually wasn't until I started working at CNHP that I finally met someone else who was Chinese and Caucasian, and I was so excited. I don't know if they were as excited as I was, but I was super excited because I'm like, we're going to have all of these things in common, and they get it. And it's funny. I mean, they became a really close friend, and we obviously had some experiences in common. But as being multiracial or biracial, I find that maybe one culture is going to take a little bit more of a lead in how you're raised or brought up, or your even just foods or celebrations and things like that. And the way she brought up, more Chinese. In talking to her, she said that she identified as Chinese. And if I'm being honest, I was a little bit jealous because I really felt that I missed out on that. But in talking to her, she's like, oh, did you experience, did you bring, when your mom made you lunch, did everyone think it was weird? And I'm like, my mom didn't make me lunch. My mom bought me a lunch card. But it was something that, even I could still relate to. And other times when, if we had something where they'd bring a food from your country or whatever, things like that. But as excited as I was to meet someone who had the same racial makeup or similar to what I am, and we did have a lot in common, and it was really great to meet. They had a very different childhood because it is multiracial. And in her case, the Chinese culture is what took the lead in her life, which is actually pretty cool because I can still go to her for some of that. But yeah.
Absolutely. That sounds so interesting to hear about how important the way that we're raised and brought up is on the way that we, I guess, experience the world or view things and the experiences that we've had. So working in Drexel administration, I'm sure you probably understand and can see about how the different populations change throughout time, and how recently there's been an increase in interracial marriages and now interracial children. Can you talk about a little bit more about how you view that population increasing might affect Drexel or other areas of academia?
Sure. I think my thoughts go a little bit to what Gabrielle was saying when she was saying, am I Black enough? We do have all of these students, well, not her saying is she Black enough, but asking to, demonstrate that she's Black enough. We have all of these students coming in that are also looking for somewhere to belong. And we have these opportunities and groups, support systems, programs that are available to students that identify as a specific race. And oftentimes, students are invited to those clubs. They're invited to those programs. Where Drexel and other universities fail is when you showed your statistics, it was one or more races. No one is taking the time to break out what those races are. So students that are multiracial are not being invited to those groups or clubs. And when I've asked about that, I was told, oh, they can self-declare. Or, oh, it's welcome to everybody. No, we're including Asians. I'm like, I don't want to be a part of your program. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if a student, is multiracial and one of those races and the race that they identify with is this group, you're saying they have to come up and say, hey, I think I'm Black enough to join this program. Do I qualify? And you're asking that of students who their whole lives have been saying, am I enough of this race or enough of that race to fit in this situation? Am I enough of this race to fit in that situation? Am I enough of that race to go sit at that table? And now you're asking them to come to college and again say, am I enough of this race to qualify for the support that you're offering? Am I enough of this race to have family dinners or some sort of cultural opportunity that isn't provided to everyone? We're asking students who have had to prove their race and their culture their entire lives to continue to prove their race and their culture their entire lives. And I think the default and easy response that universities give is, well, that's how the NIH collect data for grants. Okay, but I mean, we asked the question, we have the data. You can easily re-quantify it when you're submitting your grant and doing the one or more races. It's not that hard if you're already collecting the information to include it. The first time I filled out a list or form or test or whatever that said pick one, all that apply. And I'm like, this is going to be so funny. Someone's going to get, my data and say, Hauser's only 50% of a Chinese person. But in my head, that's like I was being counted as 50% of a Chinese person, 50% white for their data. And I thought that was awesome. And then I came to Drexel and I had access to the data. And I realized I was less visible than I was when I had to pick one. I was more visible the day that I picked Chinese. I was more visible the day that I picked white. I am more invisible the day that I picked both. Because then I'm neither Chinese, I'm not white, I am not anything other than not one of these previously stated races. And I think that's incredibly, for me, that was soul crushing to be more invisible when you think you're being more visible. And it just doesn't seem that hard. And I've asked, and I don't know why it's never occurred, or if that data lies somewhere broken out in a way where individual races are recognized for multiracial students, staff, faculty. I'd love to see it, or I'd just love to know that it exists. I haven't been able to find it, and I have asked at all sorts of levels. Hey, out of curiosity, is that a thing? And I haven't gotten an answer. I've gotten, we'll look into it. But as the population becomes multiracial, more biracial, this is going to be more and more important. Our students are going to be looking for places where they can find people that are like them, or at least have had similar struggles or similar experiences of feeling like an outsider at their own family reunion, feeling like an outsider in school and class. And they deserve those resources, just like those that identify as a single race. So I think it's sad that we can't break out the data. We're collecting it. We should be able to access it. And it's detrimental to the people that you're asking about, because you are othering them in a way that they've been othered their entire lives. And if you're going to ask, then you should be able to do something with that information.
Absolutely. This is a huge inclusivity issue, not just within Drexel, not just within academia, but as you mentioned before, the NIH, which is above it all. And the fact that people have to ask and put themselves out there in an already uncomfortable situation to say, can I be included too? Am I enough? And to have them, and to ask that question is to give other people the power to say, no, you're not. You're not. Generally speaking, people might not say that, but the fact that you ask the question and the fact that people aren't being asked, they aren't being actively invited, they aren't being shown the resource, is incredibly ostracizing in and of itself. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some historical context that may be a little bit sensitive, that has shown that the past has caused conflict between certain races, and during periods of contention, it can be brought up to the surface at full force. Some of those things that have happened, especially in the United States, have been colonialism, the LA riots, also known as the Rodney King riots or the 1992 Los Angeles uprising, slavery and colorism, and especially in this day and age, stereotypes and the model minority. Jasmyn, would you be able to tell us a little bit about how colonialism has impacted America and caused racial contention between certain races?
Yes, most definitely. So colonialism, as the definition said, it was when mostly European countries came to and pretty much colonized and settled in other areas. And a lot of them came to here in the Americas, whether North or South America. And they began to kind of like, mix with the indigenous or with the African populations as time went on, especially in Latin America. The Spanish mixed with both Native American and African individuals. And unfortunately, that led to those whom were children of those ancestries often being excluded from the main population. And, an example of that would be mulatto, which is a term that is referred to as derogatory now. So, it's not something to really describe people, but unfortunately back in the day, it was used to describe those who were mixed with Spanish and African ancestry. And unfortunately, if you appeared to be of African descent, you were kind of regarded as less than those who didn't appear as such. And so that often led to colorism, lighter individuals being regarded as more privileged and superior than those who had darker skin, even if they were mixed with someone of Spanish ancestry. So unfortunately, that is what colonialism has led to, and it's still very apparent now in this day and age, colorism and how lighter skin is viewed as more privileged than those who have darker skin.
Thank you so much. It's really saddening to hear about how certain groups of people who were biracial or multiracial, the term used to describe them is used derogatorily. And the fact that instead of being celebrated for their diversity, they're being persecuted or put down because of their background, which we all know they had no control over. And I was wondering if Gabrielle could talk to us a little bit more about the LA riots as well as slavery and colorism.
Sure. So I just wanted to ask you, did you want me to also go over French
colonialism? We can just mention that it happened.
Okay. I just wanted to briefly say that particularly French individuals, especially, I'll just be honest with my mom, that's not a topic that they like to discuss. Colonialism is very much, it's very much present in France, especially now with a lot of individuals, especially from African countries immigrating to France. So that's very much present. And I know recently there's been a huge issue with policing, just like in the US, in France. And that's caused, I think, a lot of friction, particularly with African descent individuals in France. And I'm sure as many of you all know, France has colonized just like other European countries, have colonized many populations, many countries. And a lot of these countries do have French influences. But as far as like the LA riots go, I am not sure if any of you are familiar with this, but this happened, as I stated, in 1992. And this Rodney King was an individual that was essentially attacked by the police. It was filmed, and that created a big uproar in LA in the early 1990s, which they essentially, a lot of individuals went in, burned, kind of rioted a lot of things, burned down a lot of buildings, because they were upset with how Rodney King was treated by the police. This created a lot of tension between Black and particularly Korean individuals. There was a lot of individuals that were Asian, but specifically Korean, that had stores in the LA area, and the individuals were essentially destroying their businesses. And that created a lot of contention between that community with Black individuals. As far as slavery and colorism goes, Jasmyn spoke to colorism, but slavery and colorism go essentially hand in hand. There is a lot of colorism within a lot of other communities of color, especially within the African American community, where, as Jasmyn stated, for prime example, for myself, I am deemed privileged because I am lighter skinned compared to an individual who identifies as a darker complexion of myself. And a lot of that stems from slavery and how individuals were treated during that time, which has had lasting effects and intergenerational trauma within families, Black families. Let's say there.
Great, thank you so much. And Amanda, could you tell us a little bit more about how harmful stereotypes and the model minority can be on people?
Sure. So admittedly, I wanted to look a little further into this. I had heard the term model minority before, but I wanted to look into it. And the more I read, the more I realized this could probably be a Tuesday topic on its own. Because for this conversation, I'm going to focus on certain things, but for the most part, I think it's detrimental and hurtful to many people. But the definition that Dr. Carey helped me with is a model minority is perceived as better than other minoritized groups, as if its members have overcome adversities, do not face racism, and do not need anti-racist support. As that definition says, it implies that because they are the model, they don't need support, they're doing just great. And whether they're multiracial or identify as one race, that's not necessarily the case. Just because they are part of a group that society or authors have decided are a model minority, it doesn't mean that they're doing okay. It doesn't mean that they don't need support. And language like this can often make a person or lead to the feeling of being a forever minority, being a forever foreigner, like they are never going to be an American. They're always going to be the outside. They're always going to be this other thing. And again, when you think back to your own experiences, when Nicole was talking about, people would say, "What are you?" I always used to I felt snarky as a 10-year-old. I'd always say I'm American, because that's what I felt like I was. And when you say something, "Oh, model minority," you're kind of saying you're not. You're really just kind of a guest here, and that's not the case. And also in my search, I realized that this term is not in our glossary of terms, along with some others that Nicole had helped us identify. So when its next iteration and next update, we will be adding these terms and then some of the other terms that were identified in the process of developing Nicole's Tuesday topic.
Great, thank you so much. Now you might be wondering, what all this talk about the past has to do with biracial or multiracial individuals. So going back to some of the things that we've mentioned previously, the internal and external conflict. Internal conflict happens within yourself. You're trying to find your identity. It might have to do with your family and the way that you were brought up. Now imagine if maybe you were half African American and you were half Asian and you came from California. And maybe there could be lasting contentions from the LA riots within your own family and the way these interracial families and these multiracial children experience that, or individuals. These histories haven't gone away. They're still affecting us today. There's external conflict in the way that you are treated and perceived by others. They might read about these things in their history textbooks, and that's what they think of and assume and remember about that certain race. You could mention colorism and stereotypes in the way that people look, and you're treating them a certain way because you make certain assumptions about them. And all of this doesn't just affect people of one race, it affects people of biracial people as well as multiracial people. So bringing this all back to academia, where can Drexel improve? Through speaking with Gabrielle, we discussed how we could include group therapy spaces for biracial and multiracial students, filling a hole that we noticed there was. We could create clubs or affinity groups that center around biracial and multiracial students. While doing my research for this Tuesday topic, I was not able to find a single club or affinity group that was for this population. And we could also branch that off to mean in groups that include certain races, there are certain centered around certain races or ethnicity, that those groups should include and reach out to students who are biracial or multiracial and have that as part of their identified racial makeup. And as Amanda brought to light, it's important that Drexel changes the way that they report race, that biracial and multiracial students shouldn't just be chucked in the other bucket because it's easier. It's important for all aspects of our racial background to be showcased and shared with others and not just, oh, that's too complicated. That's too difficult. We're not going to do that. And going off of that a little bit more, improving identification overall. As we've mentioned, standardized testing has slowly improved throughout time. Before, you had to pick, am I white or am I Asian? You're able to pick other, you're able to pick 2 or more races, but to be able to showcase all of that would be incredibly important and validating. We can include, as I mentioned before, biracial and multiracial students in groups that are targeted at one race or ethnicity. And as a society, as a population, whether you're in academia, you're working somewhere else, or day to day, you're living your personal life, we need to work on making less assumptions based solely on appearance, taking a step back and realizing the effect our words have on others. Now I'd like to take some time and see if anybody has any questions for us that we could answer, any questions or comments. We're right about out of time. Adenike, could you unmute and share with us?
Hi, yeah, sorry. First off, thank you so much for putting this together. It's really helpful to hear perspectives that sometimes get lost, in the shuffle when we talk about race and ethnicity and cultures and backgrounds. This is more of a comment, and I was speaking about kind of tying into what Jasmyn was saying regarding like colonialism and how especially like in Spanish American, in like Spanish colonies in the Americas, how like race and Blackness, particularly being identified or associated with Blackness, was kind of like erased. And I came across an interesting experience, just kind of like talks to that, where I was at one point, and I had the opportunity to be an exchange student in Argentina many, many years ago, and never came across many people who were Black. Like in the town I was in, I was it pretty much. And years later, I kind of got to figure out what that is. I came across a book that talks about how being Black was such a lower, a undesirable sort of condition. At one point, there was slavery in Argentina, but it got to the point where it was preferable for people, especially women of African ancestry, to either have children with men of Spanish ancestry and then claim that their children were indigenous folks, because people of indigenous groups were, under Spanish laws, given more rights, given more access to resources in society than people who were identified as descendants of Africans. And so it got to the point that through either intermarriage or just how people were labeling themselves, they stopped tracking that there were people of African descent. So this is really interesting that there are probably a lot more people of a mixed heritage and may not even be aware of it, because there have been these efforts to erase that. So thank you for like keeping a conversation very prominent so that, people's experiences don't get lost.
Thank you. That's really interesting to hear about. And, the more that you learn about history, the more you understand about how that's impacting the people of today, and the way that, shall we say, biracial or interracial marriages and unions and children have been used to improve their way in life. I think we're all out of time. Is that correct?
Thank you, Nicole, Jasmyn, Gabrielle, Amanda. That was really, it was really moving. It was really very great to hear your experiences. So thank you for joining us. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time at our next Tuesday topic.